But also, how is the international community going to deal and approach with these types of situations? Because it's not just a national or binational issue between the occupier and the other forces or in the country being occupied. It's also about regional and global security and helping. So this is where we really are coming at this, and it is amazing that the agency has been able to make it happen. And as you mentioned, we hope that there will be a permanence in terms of their presence and to make sure that we're getting unbiased feedback on what is happening in real time.
That's the voice of Dr. Cindy Vestergaard, a senior fellow and director with the Nuclear Safeguards Program at the Stimpson Center. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plashers Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, how was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. Good morning. My weekend was good. I had a nice long weekend because of Labor Day, hung out with some friends and family, played some games, nothing exciting. How was your weekend?
Same here, stuck around for the Labor Day weekend, which was kind of nice because the town is very quiet. Had a lot of time to do stuff around the house. All good. So it was nice to have some downtime.
That's great. Well, we got a short week ahead of us, but of course, as always, there's nuclear news happening. So what do you have for us there?
Well, unfortunately, we have bad news on the Iran nuclear front. Last week, Iran sent its reply to the United States' text on the nuclear deal. And in the U.S. view, the Iran response was a step backwards. And the EU's chief diplomat, Josep Borrell, who is known for being positive about these things, said that if the process does not converge, then the whole process is in danger. So the Iranians are apparently insisting that the UN must close its investigation into Tehran's nuclear program, and that the United States must guarantee that a future administration will not leave the deal. These are two things that Iran has been asking for a long time, that the Biden administration thought progress was being made on. But these are also two things that the Biden administration cannot do anything about. And this is a major setback for the talks, and there is now speculation that the Biden team might give up on reviving the deal until after the November elections. You know, this would be a mistake for at least two reasons. First, as we know from polling, the Iran deal is actually popular with voters. So it's not a problem to have a congressional vote on the deal soon before the elections. And second, depending on how the elections go, if Republicans gain seats, this would send a signal to Iran that a Republican will win the White House in 2024, and thus add to their concern that the United States will withdraw from the deal again. So the bottom line here for the Biden administration is that diplomacy remains the only way to resolve this crisis, so please don't give up on diplomacy. On the Ukraine front, Moscow and Kyiv are accusing each other of risking catastrophe by shelling the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The plant is now reportedly disconnected from the power grid and is running on backup power. This, as people may know, is extremely dangerous since the plant needs power to cool its nuclear fuel, and without cooling, the nuclear fuel could melt, leading to a radiation emergency. Fortunately, just last week, Chief UN Nuclear Inspector Rafael Grossi led a daring mission to Zaporizhzhia, and 2 UN staff remain on the site to monitor the situation. It's great that we have some independent monitoring going on now. Grossi is expected to brief the UN Security Council in New York on his findings from that trip on Tuesday. We will have more on this developing story later in this episode. Finally, on the Korean Peninsula, senior officials from Japan, the United States, and South Korea will meet this week to discuss North Korea. The meeting comes as U.S. intelligence reports that Russia is buying artillery shells and rockets from North Korea. And officials say Russia's decision to turn first to Iran and now to North Korea is a sign that sanctions and export controls imposed by the United States and Europe are making it difficult for Moscow to obtain military supplies to prosecute its brutal war in Ukraine. Lauren, turning to you, what do we have lined up on Early Warning?
This week on Early Warning, our Hale Fellow, Angela Kellett, sat down with Dr. Angela Stent, a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of the book Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. They discuss Gorbachev's passing and the legacy he leaves behind.
And then I speak with Dr. Cindy Vestergaard. She's a senior fellow and director with the Nuclear Safeguards Program at the Stimpson Center. We discuss the UN inspector's visit to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. We look at why they went, how they got there, and what will happen next. And as we've discussed, it's a very important story, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. On August 30th, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, died in Moscow. His passing reminds us of the importance of diplomacy and restraint, rather than seeing nuclear weapons as the status quo. His legacy should remind us that progress is possible. This progress is at a risk of collapsing. The INF Treaty has been abandoned by the U.S., and New START inspections have been paused by Russia. Talks between the U.S. and Russia to replace New START have been paused indefinitely since Russia invaded Ukraine, and nuclear stockpiles are on the rise again for the first time in decades. Gorbachev's world is vastly different from the one that Putin is trying to create. Today we are joined by Dr. Angela Stent, a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
I'm delighted to be on your program.
So let's start with the first question. What was Gorbachev's legacy?
So he had a rich legacy, both sort of domestically inside Russia and in foreign policy. So if we just mention what happened inside the Soviet Union, he came to power. He realized this was a completely ossified system and that it had to change, that they couldn't go on living like that. And so he opened up society for discussion. He encouraged people to criticize what they didn't like about the system. In the end, he allowed there to be not competitive political parties, but competitive political movements. There was much greater freedom of expression. And he also allowed historians and scholars to look at the dark pages, if you like, of Soviet history, to open up the archives, to talk about Stalin, about all the bad things that had happened in the Soviet Union. So he just brought a much greater sense of freedom of expression and personal freedom to the Soviet Union, which had had this, very repressive system for nearly 70 years. Now, in foreign affairs, of course, he really opened up to the West. He jettisoned the Marxist ideology that said that Russia and the West were doomed to be in conflict and believed in interdependence and cooperation. And he really very sincerely believed that nuclear weapons were a major danger, that when he came to power, he was determined to reduce the possibility of nuclear war. Before he'd come to power, Russia, the Soviet Union, had deployed intermediate-range missiles facing Europe, and the United States was deploying and had deployed missiles in Germany and Britain to face the Soviet Union and therefore escalating the danger really of a nuclear conflict. And so it was his desire and his wish to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And it's interesting, the first time he met President Reagan, which was in 1985 in Geneva, they already started talking about the need for nuclear disarmament. And then when they met the next year in 1986 in Reykjavik, he apparently was able to persuade President Reagan that their goal should not be only getting rid of these intermediate range weapons, but getting rid of all nuclear weapons. And I think he managed to open up President Reagan's mind on these issues too. And so you've got the landmark intermediate range treaty signed in 1987 between the United States and the Soviet Union, for the first time getting rid of an entire category of nuclear weapons. And then both presidents came out saying, we want to rid the world of nuclear weapons by the year 2000.
Clearly, Gorbachev had a different view of nuclear weapons than President Putin, who kind of sees himself as a sort of anti-Gorbachev. How has this contributed to the war in Ukraine?
So Putin definitely believes that Russia is a great power because of its nuclear weapons. And Putin has been quite clear about that from even before this war began, but certainly since it's begun, he has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. He has reminded the world that Russia has this new supersonic class of nuclear weapons. As you mentioned, both the United States and Russia are developing more lethal weapons now. There is an arms race that's already begun. So Putin, for him, Gorbachev really is the anti-hero. He dislikes Gorbachev, of course, because of Gorbachev's policies that the Soviet Union collapsed. We note that President Putin is not going to attend Mr. Gorbachev's funeral, and he did pay tribute to him where he was lying in state, but he's not going to go to the funeral. So he has really reversed all of this. You also mentioned that negotiations on a follow-on to the New START treaty have really been suspended now since the war began. The Russians won't allow these on-site inspections. So unfortunately, we are heading back now under Putin to an era where nuclear weapons really weren't well regulated, and therefore the danger of a nuclear war will increase.
So given all of that, what can we do to carry on Gorbachev's commitment to a nuclear-free world?
I think the most important thing is to try and restart negotiations, to understand that even though the relationship between the United States and Russia at the moment has reached a very low point, we both have a national interest in preventing the outbreak of a nuclear war and preventing proliferation. Because without agreements between Russia and the United States, this encourages proliferation and there are a number of states in the region around Russia, in the Middle East and other places where countries would like to acquire nuclear weapons. So it really is the responsibility of the US and Russia to maintain these contacts and to try and negotiate a follow-on to the New START agreement. Certainly the Biden administration has said that that's what it wants to do. And the Russians have occasionally said that, yes, we need to talk about these issues. But right now, in the middle of this war, those negotiations are suspended. But that's the most important thing. And it's important for the American public and for the publics in other countries and democracies, certainly, to demand from their leaders that there be more agreements going forward on nuclear weapons, because without the INF treaty, which of course the Trump administration pulled out of, and then the Russians did too, without that treaty, you could have the redeployment of these intermediate range nuclear weapons either in Europe or in Asia. Neither Russia nor the US has said they have any intention to do that now, but we don't know. And then I would also add China. China is growing its nuclear arsenal. And I think in the absence of an agreement between the US and Russia, that will encourage the Chinese to have a larger nuclear arsenal. So it's really incumbent on both sides to try to understand that they have to talk about these issues, however bad the relationship is on all other levels.
Unfortunately, we are out of time today, but thank you for joining me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the largest in Europe, is in the middle of a war zone. It has been under Russian control and under attack since early March, and continued attacks on the plant could lead to another Chernobyl or Fukushima-style radiation disaster. The UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has been calling for inspections for months. Finally, IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi was allowed to lead a team to the plant last week. This was a tremendously brave thing to do, as the plant is still under attack. Upon his return to Vienna last week, Grossi told the media that the physical integrity of the plant had been repeatedly violated, adding that military operations in the region had increased recently. 6 UN inspectors from the agency remain at the facility, and 2 of those inspectors will remain at the plant, hopefully permanently. Today we are joined by Dr. Cindy Vestergaard, a senior fellow and director of the Nuclear Safeguards Program at the Stimpson Center. Cindy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
So let's start at the beginning. Please explain what has been happening at Zaporizhzhia, at the nuclear power plant, and why there is so much concern about what's going on there.
Well, as you mentioned, military forces, Russian military forces, have been at the plant since March 4th. And this is actually 8 days after the Russian military took over, had forces also at Chernobyl. Now, they have since left Chernobyl, which is maybe an interesting thing we could talk about as well, but they have stayed at Zaporizhzhia. And the fighting around Zaporizhzhia, it is an active conflict zone, which means that there is shelling that is quite close to the facility, including water, power supplies, and this is what supports the plant. And we particularly, or not we, but the Zaporizhzhia and the power plant needs to be able to have power supply to be able to keep the heat moderated by water and make sure that the atom doesn't get unleashed. And so that's an incredibly important part, obviously, is the safety side of things and the physical integrity of the facility itself. And this is something that Grossi had mentioned in the press conference. The other aspects, of course, is safeguards. So there's 3 S principles when we're talking about nuclear, particularly safety, security, and safeguards. So this power plant in Ukraine as a whole has an agreement with the IAEA to provide information on its activities related to its nuclear material. So since March 4th, the agency has been very good in providing updates daily, certainly in the very beginning, and keeping that going. Last I saw was 2 days ago was update 96. So we have a long way to go, but safeguards is a big part to understand and make sure that no nuclear material has been removed. And if so, where has it gone? We do have, with Russia, it is a nuclear weapons state that is also now annexing Europe's largest nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of material there. There's also a spent fuel storage facility there, which is also of grave concern in terms of the potential for that material, plutonium particularly in that could make bombs. So the material that it's being used in peaceful purposes, it has not been diverted and is still be able to be accounted for. So these are the main aspects, of course, that the inspection team is there to do.
So just to recap for listeners, so the main concern from your perspective is radiation exposure as a result of electricity or power loss to the plant that would interrupt the cooling systems, right, and lead to some kind of a meltdown of the facility. And then the physical security and control of the nuclear material at the plant that could be diverted. Do I have that right?
Exactly. Well, the physical integrity, of course, does lead into the safety side of things. I mean, shelling actually at the facility. So not just in terms of power supply being cut, but actual rockets, let's say, going and targeting the facility. Maybe not targeting, but maybe ricochet that way, right? Or accidents happen, particularly in war zones. The other aspect that Grossi does talk a lot about too, which I should certainly underscore, is the personnel, the Ukrainian staff that are at the facility. This is something he also mentioned in the press release. They are obviously under incredible amounts of stress. They have occupiers by gun that are there. So there is an occupying force. And then, of course, the continual barrage and making sure that they are keeping that facility working and in safe operation conditions as much as they can. So there's a lot of factors that are at play. An active military zone or active military conflict is something that is unprecedented. This is the first time in our nuclear age that a country with such a robust nuclear power program, Ukraine is the 7th largest civilian nuclear power in the world. And so this power plant in particular is, as I mentioned, Europe's largest. And so there's a lot of concern about making sure that it is safe, secure, and safeguarded.
Now, I've read that this is the first time that we have seen a nuclear power plant in a war zone. Is that right?
That is correct. Libya has some facilities in terms of a civilian war, a civilian conflict, But here we have an occupying power coming in and also targeting, going in and actually taking over nuclear facilities. And it's incredibly unprecedented. And I think this is what is also why we're, so focused on this, not just in terms of the safety aspects, of course, and the potential effects to human health and environment, but also how is the international community going to deal and approach with these types of situations? Because it's not just a national or binational issue between occupier and the other forces or the country being occupied. It's also about regional and global security and health and environment. So this is where we really are coming at this, and it is amazing that the agency has been able to make it happen. And as you mentioned, we hope that there will be a permanence in terms of their presence and to make sure that we're getting unbiased feedback on what is happening in real time.
So let's talk about the agency's involvement for a minute. The agency the IAEA has been trying to get to Zaporizhzhia for months now. Why did it take so long, and how did they do it?
I'm really looking forward to reading the book whenever all this is done about all the interplays. This is obviously, March 10th, less than a week after Russian forces were at Zaporizhzhia, Grossi was meeting in Turkey with Russian and Ukrainian representatives. So it starts really that far back, where Grossi has been calling for IAEA access to be able to make sure that the safety, security, and safeguards of the facility under their responsibility is being covered. But the challenges are, of course, where the agency works under a nation-state system that we have created in the post-World War UN system, where just because an occupying force goes in and puts their flag in, that doesn't mean that the international community, of course, recognizes it. So Russia may say, come on in, but by doing so, then you have to recognize our occupying power. And that is something that does not happen. We do not recognize a state until the UN recognizes it as a state. And you can look at, of course, that situation when it comes to Crimea since 2014. So the agency hasn't been able to access a very small research facility there that was also under their purview. So that's one of the biggest challenges for an international organization entering an active conflict zone. The other, of course, is Ukraine would have those same concerns. And Ukraine has mentioned even while in terms of the case of what happened with the ongoing case with Crimea, they have mentioned that they consider themselves Ukraine and they have still the sovereignty over those facilities, even if someone else is in there right now, because they are considered a nation state and we have not in any way recognized a difference in those boards internationally.
So they had to figure out some way to get around all that. And how did they do it?
That's a great question. That's what I was saying. I'm waiting for the book. My sense is, a lot of back and forth, and I'm sure there are a lot of the details. Devil's always in the details, of course, when it comes to diplomacy, and everything from commas to the right words would have been gone over again and again. And to be able to get them this far and to be able to see this press release that 6 inspectors are still there and that 2 more will be remaining, how this is going to work in terms of rotations. Are those 2 going to rotate out? Is it going to be a permanent mission? Is it going to be something, all these kinds of things still have to be worked out down the line. So I think we're going to see more of a work in progress as this is going through. Again, this is all unprecedented, not just in terms of the situation that Ukraine is in, but also in terms of the agency in what it's in and its role here. But we do need that impartial international inspectorate response and feedback about what is going to the international community and to be able to get that unfiltered.
Completely agree, and great admiration for those inspectors that have stayed behind at Zaporizhzhia who are taking on this dangerous mission, as well as to the Ukrainian workers at the plant that have been working under incredibly dangerous, stressful conditions for the past months. It's really quite a story. So let's talk about what Grossi and his team found at the plant and what they're hoping to accomplish. Watching the press conference, Grossi seemed pretty satisfied with the visit. He basically said, I've seen everything I want to see, right? Nothing was hidden from me. We're getting all the information we want. So do you have a sense of what they saw and what they're going to do now to satisfy themselves that things are getting better?
He did say that anywhere he wanted to go, if he said he wanted to go left or right or see something specific, that he had full access. So that is a good sign. That is really a good sign and a good start to their presence there. What they have found so far, we're not going to know fully yet. As I understand it, there will be, and as he mentioned in the press conference, there will be a report to the Board of Governors. They are expecting the team that is staying behind to provide, obviously, their initial reports or thoughts to Grossi and the agency. And then we'll see what goes from there and what they are finding. But I think it's too early for us to say exactly what it is that they have found so far. I don't know. I doubt there's any conclusions that are coming out of it today, but they surely will be coming.
Presumably, some of the things they were looking at is the state of backup electricity supply systems. So, for example, one of the scenarios that people have talked about is that the nuclear power plant loses its connection to the grid, loses outside power source, and therefore is in danger of not being able to cool the reactor unless the diesel generators are there to back up. So it's all that kind of stuff that I imagine they'll be looking at to make sure that everything is in good working order. So what do you think happens next? Where hopefully we'll hear the reports of what they found at the plant. Hopefully it'll be safe enough for the IAEA inspectors to stay permanently or as long as they need to stay at the plant. Where do you see this going in the longer term?
That's a great question and a hard one, of course. I do hope that there will be a sustained presence by the agency. And of course, that also can involve the containment and surveillance systems that are there, the cameras. Hopefully, maybe there can be some other aspects that can be put in if the inspectors need to leave. And hopefully, they will always be invited back. I do have a concern that once they leave, that it becomes harder to go back. So I also, at the same time, recognize you need to be able to rotate people in and out because it is an incredibly taxing situation. It's hard to know how, of course, the war will play out. And this is something that is obviously going to determine a number of the different factors around that power plant. Also, I hope we do not see that there's another power plant that undergoes this as well. We've already been through 2, and now we're down to 1 again. But it is a situation that is obviously constantly evolving. And again, just another reason why we need to have the voice of the IAEA coming out of this.
This is, in fact, the second nuclear power station that has come into this picture through the war, right? At the beginning of the war, in a surprising tactical move, Russia used the exclusion zone around Chernobyl to launch its attack, which I certainly wasn't looking for. I don't know if other people were, but tell me your thoughts about that and how Russia used that tactic and how that all worked out.
Well, in some respects, it was an easy target in that it's just a few, well, I think it was 12 to 15 kilometers from the Belarusian border. So it's right there as they were coming through on February 24th. So they actually took it over very quickly within a matter of hours, obviously, since crossing through the border. It's fear factor, right? I mean, to be able to go in nuclear is a fear factor. It is something that can be whipped up, can be used as part of disinformation campaigns. And Chernobyl, of course, is in our psyche. It is part of the scars that are there in the nuclear sector, but certainly in Ukraine and Europe. So going in and saying, well, now we've got a presence at Chernobyl just sends tingles and shivers through the international community. It's interesting why they left. I think almost that, and I think that might be more of the interesting story, is that maybe if they thought it's even too crazy for us to do this, and then why would we stay here? Because Chernobyl obviously has everything that I just mentioned, everything that's part of it. So it's not the easiest to maintain. It also has obviously these reactors and Zaporizhzhia, it's just such a different case, obviously. And it's fascinating still too that why they would be there. And I think that the fear factor is obviously still there. It's also about energy. And that's also where Russia has a fear factor, right? We're talking about gas and oil and pipelines being suspended and the power that Russia has over energy in Europe and of course abroad. So it's the fear factor is not just in terms of the safety side, which is there. And if they can say that, well, hey, we've been able to maintain safety despite shelling all around, it could be a weird way to play it. But I think it's really about taking this and really raising the fear factor, because nuclear is at the heart of geopolitics. And of course, also the fear when it comes to human and environmental catastrophe.
Great point. What you say about the fear factor is just so true. By occupying the plant, Russia can blow it up. Russia can turn it off. Russia can redirect the power, presumably. So it gives Russia a whole lot of leverage. Is that the way you see Putin's interest in this plant?
Most definitely.
So last question for you, because we're running out of time, but I wonder if we can't sort of back up and take a step back and look at what does this crisis mean, if anything, for the future of nuclear power? Because, of course, as we mentioned, this is the first time a major plant like this has been caught in a war zone. Clearly, nuclear power plants and war do not mix well. What are the lessons that we should learn from this?
Well, one of the effects that we're already starting to see is that countries that were considering and hadn't signed contracts yet, we're also seeing those that had signed contracts pulling back from Russia and looking at the VVERs that Russia produces. So that's one impact that you'll start to see within the nuclear energy sector, I think. How this also is impacting supply chains is also an area that I think requires a lot more study for us to understand and look at about that. That's also one of the things that the agency was looking at as well, and making sure that parts are able to be supplied. Looking at sanctions, I think we could start to see some murmurings and potentially some action when, I'm not sure, but also looking at sanctioning Russia's uranium and what that will mean for nuclear energy, and inventories and stockpiles of fuel will be part of the conversation going forward. But I think really one of the biggest aspects of this and looking at this from the future is how does the international community deal with power plants or other types of nuclear facilities in active war zones. And this is something now that obviously this is going to be an ongoing war for however long it's going to be going on for. So this is going to set a precedent for how the agency is going to do that, but also how its states parties to the NPT and member states of the agency are also going to respond to this. So the war and its ramifications in terms of annexation of nuclear facilities is something that is going to be obviously written by lawyers also for a long time. There's going to be many books, Tom, that are going to be coming out of this. And I'm very heartened that the agency has been able to get in there so that we can at least start to get better information and understanding more about what's happening on the ground.
Cindy, thank you so much for your time and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.